like clearly you will have like an agent navigate the web and take actions on your behalf. So far, I think it's in a similar phase where it's kind of very cool on a video, but like it's just not that useful yet. But we're like very actively testing it because I think, at that point where that will be very useful, people will use this a lot. And then also the way we, for example, produce a product and what we have to optimize for changes quite a bit.
Welcome to Get Discovered, a podcast about AI, SEO, and online discoverability. In this first season, we're focusing on simplifying AI. We're taking a step back and trying to discover how people are using it, what AI really is, and make it easier to understand for you and your business. Today, we're speaking with Marius Meiners, founder of Peec.ai. Peec is an analytics tool that lets you see how your brand is showing up in AI search tools like ChatGPT or Perplexity. You can see what chat queries you're mentioned in, how you rank compared to competitors, overall visibility, and more. Welcome to the show, Marius. We're really excited to have you today.
Well, thank you.
So the vibe of this first season is really trying to explore the topic of AI in a really high level sense. And the idea is that no one has a clear definition of it. And I think a lot of times people are talking about ChatGPT and Perplexity and these large language model based tools as this definition of AI, which I think they're definitely a subset of it overall. But that's the goal, is just to try to see if we can coalesce around a singular or as singular as possible definition of AI. And we've been crowdsourcing this a little bit. So before I ask you for your definition, I want to read a couple of that have come through our little process here. And yeah, we'll just start that way and kind of get your thoughts. So starting with the first one. So this comes from a founder of a B2B SaaS company. And to the question, what is your definition of AI? They said, kind of like a calculator for language or visuals. It's an application that can emulate the way a human thinks and can produce answers to complex questions using information found online. So quite an interesting, I think, again, we're really caught in this, just everyone thinking about ChatGPT as AI. I think that's like, there's something much broader to that. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that definition specifically already includes like information found online, which is then like goes into like the training data, and then that's like trade transformer model, etc. So that's, I guess, a pretty niche definition already. I guess for me, I would define it as any intelligence that is non-human and kind of generally applicable, right? Because you also have intelligence where you train a computer to just do like chess, but then that's not super useful for any application outside of chess. So I would define it as AI as being like any intelligence that's non-human, that's like generally applicable to like any task.
Yeah. It makes sense, but I'm going to give you a little bit of crap because you use the word in the definition, right?
Sure.
So I mean, we can go a couple of different ways. We can maybe restate that, or maybe and this is a topic that's come up a lot too, as we talk about intelligence. What does intelligence mean? And as we're trying to talk about it in the context of artificial intelligence, I think it also exposes the fact that we all have different definitions of intelligence itself. So how would you sort of balance that? Where would you take this?
Yeah, I think a good point on using using the name in the definition. So maybe like system of thinking, maybe like a, non-human system of thinking that comes up with like answers or reasoning to things that's non-human and then generally applicable. Maybe you can define it that way. That's maybe more useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you ever run into, I mean, if you, given where you work, right? What the company you founded, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Do you ever have any trouble explaining what you do to your friends or family?
Man, like in December, so much. I think now it's completely shifted because ChatGPT is just, so widely adopted now. Like my girlfriend, she used to never like use this stuff until like March. And then she had to do like something for uni, and I told her like, hey, this is probably going to be like pretty useful for you, if you like just like type in some questions and get some answers. And now she's like an absolute power user. Now she uses to like check the weather, like find gift ideas, and like, find the next like studio to do like a Pilates class. So she really does like everything in there now, which I think is super cool. And the people are just like using it so much now that now everybody gets it. And I'm just like, hey, if you need to show up in ChatGPT as a brand, that's kind of what we do, So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually had a really funny experience with my mom. She has an apartment that she rents out to people, and she was having trouble thinking of the listing, right? What to write for the advertisement. I said, "Oh, I've been talking about ChatGPT with you for months, and you never really understood it. let me show you. And I walked her through the whole thing. And this is, you go to
That's
this website,
perfect.
you can
Yeah.
type in these things. Yeah, it was beautiful. However, even though she was really amazed, she got a good, listing. She ended up renting the apartment. She hasn't used it a single time since. And do you see that? Do you see maybe like a little bit of a generational gap here? So you talk about your girlfriend; she's a power user now, but what about different generations, either in personal life or in work? Do you see any gaps there?
Think at least statistically, I know that this is absolutely true. So I think if you ask like someone that's like below 18, they actually don't Google anymore like whatsoever. And then if you're like 60 or above and you just got accustomed to Google, like then you probably also won't change anymore, I would assume, right? So for that generation, it's probably pretty hard to adopt not new technology. And I think that's just like generally always true that like all the generations are just slower on like adoption of new stuff. So I think that's definitely something there. Yeah.
Yeah. So transitioning a little bit and really kind of on the same topic. So if we could talk about AI in action and examples of how you're using it in your personal life and then some of the impact it's kind of had. I know as a founder of an AI search tool, you're obviously using it in a lot of different ways on a daily basis. But are there any kind of use cases you can point to where the technology has really changed the way you think or you work?
Think for sure there were actually so many. So when I thought about the idea for what the company should be doing, we had like some rough conversations with people like, hey, is this something you guys would be interested in? Type conversations, and then typically it's like hard to put like something as an idea in front of them. I don't really know Figma, like I'm terrible with like UX like creation, so just like actually vibe coded it. So I can actually code, but I realized that if I wrote down React code and TypeScript, it would just take too long, and I haven't coded for like years, so I realized it would just take like weeks. So I sat down for like an entire day with like V0, which is like the same as Lovable or Bolt or Rapid Agent, and just vibe coded it in like a day and a half, and it was pretty decent. Like you could actually show it to someone that would get the idea, and they could be like, okay, cool, like I need this button there, and like this is kind of like missing still. So it just saved me like weeks of work essentially at that time, which was like in December. And there these tools were like super new, so I think V0 came out like 4 weeks before that. So I was super lucky with the timing that I could already leverage it to like save my time. And there are so many applications now where it's like deeply integrated. So for example, we do like outreach, we enrich people, like we know where they work, like what kind of like the size of the company is. We do all that with AI. We pre-write emails with AI. We like transcribe our sales calls with AI and get insights from that. So we use it in like a bunch of different ways, and some of them are like super useful. And to be fair, some are still like in very early phase and like it's not that useful yet, but like we're experimenting. So there's like lots of stuff happening left and right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, talking about the vibe coding, which is a huge thing right now, and we actually
Yeah.
just posted something because we have an integration with, or you can use pre-render with Lovable apps, and you can do a lot to help for discoverability there. But let's talk about one of the use cases where you think it's really not quite there yet. Can you give me an example?
So I think email is actually a big one because like we tried like all the different email things that sit on top of your Gmail, and like they categorize your email and they're like pre-write answers. And like, it's kind of mid. Like at the first day, you're like, okay, this is great, and like the demos look cool, and the use case at the start look really cool. But then you find so many edge cases that like still like pretty rough and like don't work. And then you realize it's saving you like 20% of the time that you thought it would actually save you. So I think that still has to be like edged out. But there's a clear use case that will be very good. It just needs more work, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. So you talked about vibe coding and how that was something that, years ago that wouldn't necessarily have been possible. You would have had to sit down and do the horrible, terrible task of engineering something from scratch, which I also used to code, and I don't think I would be up for the challenge nowadays. So I can empathize with that. Is there anything that else that you or your team is doing to experiment with it that's been really unexpected and really useful?
What we're trying now, like ChatGPT agent just came out, and there've been like a bunch of these solutions out there. And I think that this is also clearly where the internet is going, right? Like clearly you will have like an agent navigate the web and take actions on your behalf. So far, I think it's in a similar phase where it's kind of very cool on a video, but like it's just not that useful yet. But we're like very actively testing it because I think, at that point where that will be very useful, people will use this a lot. And then also the way we, for example, produce our product and what we have to optimize for changes quite a bit. So we want to monitor very closely, where kind of the state of these are and where it's going. I think everybody predicted like 2025 as like the year of agents. I think it's clear that the big adoption year probably still won't be this year, and it will probably be the next year or maybe even the year after. I think it's super hard to call right now because, like as you said, like it's very good to show like demos and stuff, but then getting it from 80 to 95% is kind of where all the value is, and that's like just super hard, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
so let's see where the ecosystem goes next year and like how far everybody gets in development.
Yeah. I think that touches on something else I'd like to talk about. So I'm of the same mind. I think that sometimes a lot of these companies are overpromising. Not necessarily maybe in 5 years, yes, okay, we're going to have agents that do everything for us and we won't need to have business operations people or whatever else. Like maybe we'll get there. But I feel like the timeline communicated by a lot of companies is overly ambitious and it's not something they can really deliver on. Do you get that sense as well?
I think it's super obvious that that's true. Like you're definitely right. We talked about it now. Like they are like at 100 million revenue as of like last week, and I just for fun like last week also tested something in Lovable, and like three prompts, and I got like a massive error, and they're like, okay, like how can this be possible? Like they're like it's like a 2 billion valuation, whatever, just raised 200 million, and like so much revenue. But like even at that state, which I think is fascinating, it is still apparently so useful for people that they're willing to pay for it, right? So it obviously saves people time, it creates value in the world, and it already has so much demand that people pay a lot of money for the stuff. And that's great because in previous like technology waves, this wasn't the case. For example, we had AR VR, nobody paid money in AR VR, nobody spent time in AR
Yeah.
VR, but it was super hyped. You had crypto, nothing ever got built with crypto that had any real usage, but like a lot of money flowed into it, right? And I think this change now is so different in that there's actually revenue being generated, which probably means that there's some user value being generated, which is great.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I do wonder if we're maybe starting to look at something similar to a dot-com bubble, right? So when that happened in the early 2000s, well, end of 1999, 2000, whatever, we saw a lot of companies with really inflated valuations and like use cases that made a lot of sense in the abstract. But when you actually look at how things are working in day-to-day life, it was a little bit questionable. And I sort of feel like, for example, OpenAI, right? So they have 40 billion or so of investor capital, right? And they're burning, depending on the sources that you look. If you ask OpenAI, it says, if you ask ChatGPT, it says that OpenAI is burning 5 billion a year. You can get, other sources anywhere else. So I really feel like there's this push to kind of manufacture consent for a lot of the investments that need to be made and some of the environmental and social sacrifices that we see for this technology to grow and to be useful and meaningful. And also, a lot of that is predicated on the idea that it can already do more than it really can and may in the future do more than it really could. Right. And I'm just a little bit kind of weary of where that's all going. And I think we're not thinking critically enough about that.
It's an interesting debate to have, I think, with the dot cover, because you just talked about it. I think if you take the cumulatively invested money in like 99, and then you looked at like where did the sector go, I think you were actually kind of underinvested because if you look at now the top 10, companies with the most market cap, that's kind of like all internet companies in a way, right? So probably the return that was generated there was probably worth it, but then of course it was very focused and like very small amount of companies. And then like 95% of the companies were like overvalued, right? But I think that's typically what happens. And then these go bust. And so, of course, you have in AI right now also a bubble, I would say, with like a lot of the assets, but then some of them will be like super, super big. So I think, some bets will turn out really, really well, and then a lot of them won't. And I think this is kind of the fun nature of venture capital, where, if we didn't have this ecosystem that would make like big losses sometimes, we also couldn't generate like these great, great, amazing outcomes for both people and society. Of course, you are right that especially on the foundational model layer, there is a lot of justification now for, I guess, investment and also infrastructure sacrifice. And in a way, they're just arguing for AGI, right? That's the only thing you can really pitch for them. It's like to kind of like make the valuation work, to make the storyline and equity line work, you have to kind of pitch AGI. And then the question is, do you really get there, right? And then if you get there, how does that look like? Can you actually generate kind of the financial returns that even the investors are like expecting from AGI, right? And then what's the definition and like what can it then do? And like, so and then what's the margin on AGI? Like we, kind of all don't know these things. Yeah, so I personally probably wouldn't invest in OpenAI if I could invest in it right now. But some people are making the bet, and I think that some people are is also kind of cool, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a big portion of the capital that OpenAI is working with comes from Microsoft, right?
Yeah.
That's like 25%, so on and so forth. So it's big players with capital to lose that are making those bets. I guess it's good. because the rest of us can take a benefit from that if at some point in the future OpenAI isn't able to monetize ChatGPT, which I think the jury is still out. We'll see
Yeah,
what that,
yeah.
where that
So
gets.
we thought about this a lot, right? So especially because for us, it's important if they monetize it through ads, will the ads then be displayed in ChatGPT, and then how does it then inflect organic impressions that you may want to get on ChatGPT and stuff. So I think because they have to pitch this like AGI storyline, I think they will kind of hold on to ads until they kind of give that storyline up, because it doesn't really make sense in the broader picture to like now do ads when you're really pitching like these like agents that can like do all this like humanity work and stuff. Then why would you build an ads business? That's kind of pretty random. So I don't expect that happens this year. But of course, like this is like a 10-year play, and then who knows? This will definitely come at some point, but like who knows when and how.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I was looking into, trying to understand the future of monetization of AI, especially as pertains to discoverability and search and all of that, and reading what analysts are saying and even what like the CFO of OpenAI is saying and all of that. That's in their 2026 plan, is to talk about advertising revenue. They're forecasting $1 billion in ad revenue next year. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that changes people's interaction with the platform. The last episode we did, I talked about a video that a YouTuber put up about an alternative to ChatGPT that bid on the search terms for ChatGPT and showed up at the top of the results page when someone Googled ChatGPT, and had a logo that looked very similar to OpenAI's logo for ChatGPT. And because Google has so radically changed the way that ads are shown on the SERP, it wasn't obvious to most people that they were clicking on a sponsored link. And then they put their payment details in and subscribed to this alternative to ChatGPT without even knowing that it was some other random company that it was using like ChatGPT and other models basically as a la carte kind of service. And I think that really exposes this tension I think people have with ads and trustworthiness of content and the results that come back and all of that. And if we go to a model where ChatGPT is using ads to monetize the service, what could that look like? Is it going to be some little thing like it is now where it says, be careful, ChatGPT can make mistakes, but it's the text that's half the size of the response to the prompt. And it's, off in the corner and in light gray? Or do they kind of presence ads directly in the response, and it's really obvious to you there? It should be interesting, especially as to what that would mean for trust.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's one thing to just say, okay, here are some links that seem like they matched your query, versus here's an explanation of the things you should do to set up your personal budget for 2026. And it just so happens to be that the last 3 paragraphs of text were sponsored by someone else.
Yeah, I can kind of give you the different variants that might exist, and then we could talk about like which is better or worse. So the way we see it play out is that you have the Perplexity approach. They're already experimenting with this, and what they do is you can buy the next suggested question. So if you ask something like, "Hey, like what's the best marathon in Berlin that I can run this winter?" The response will be completely normal, but then you have like this people also ask section at the bottom where it's like, it's just like text, and you can click on the text and that becomes the next prompt. And then you can buy that the next prompt is something like, and why are Adidas running sneakers the best to run marathons in type thing, right? So that's kind of like their idea. So it will never, in this model, it would never impact the output of the model. It would just be like a suggestion at the bottom that you can click on to have like the next prompt running. So that's like that's like one model. The other model you could think of is that you just have like a shopping graph in it. And then if you asked ChatGPT, like for the best coffee machine, it shows you some products. You can click on the product and there's like some affiliate model behind it where, they make some revenue share or whatever to like generate this lead. And then the third option would be like, they just like randomly put like a box of sponsored like text in the middle of the chat response. And that's actually what you saw in AI mode. So when they presented AI mode, they had like the normal answer, and then there was like a big box of ads like in the absolute middle of the chat response. That's like the model that Google now is probably going after, and I think that's probably the worst model for consumers because that dilutes the experience the most. It's the most untrustworthy. Everybody's gonna hate it. But then of course Google makes so much money on their ad business that it's really hard for them to not do this, because their shareholders will be super upset if they just like implement AI mode and then the revenue is like super low on it because you only like sell the next question or whatever.
Right. So let's transition, because we're talking about the future of monetization, but just in a like a broader sense. So how do you envision AI and tools like Peek really being useful, genuinely useful for brands in the future? Like, where do you see it going? What do you think we'll stop doing because AI will actually handle it better? What are some skills we might want to develop or think about developing alongside AI in the workplace or in our personal lives?
I can maybe start in the macro thing, and then we can talk a little bit about what we do. So essentially, I think that kind of mid-skilled white collar work is actually going to die out. I think there's no reason you need like a average graphic designer. There's no reason you need an average writer, like copyright writer or something like that. That's just like not a thing anymore. So I think the top 10% in every class will get rewarded more because exception talent is still super valuable. Like the top 10% of developers are now more valuable than before. But like the average developer is just super hard to, really generate a positive ROI on. So I think that's like a big, big shift in society because by definition, the average person is average and that's most people. So I think that's a really big change that will affect, unfortunately, like lots of people and we have to like find ways, to deal with that. I think, there's like a big opportunity there too. So if you were to look at, for example, the big four, like PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, etc., like a lot of work that happens there is like super like boring and automatable and stuff where I used to work at those companies like you write like an email from the associate to the manager to the partner, it goes back down, and then it's just like change these four things in the Excel, and like this is like what you studied for essentially, like why, so I think a lot of that work will go away, which is great because also it's not fun work. But then what do all these people do, right? I think that's a super open question.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's as a knowledge worker myself, I often think about this, am I watching the seeds of my own demise start to grow roots, But I think the point that you made is really good. And I kind of think of it in a related but somewhat different sense. It's just in order to not allow ourselves to be wholesale replaced by AI requires us to understand how we can work together with it and leverage it as a force multiplier to be more performant and provide more value to the organizations where we work. If we sit down and stay concerned about how it's going to replace us, and as a result of that, refuse to engage with it, it will replace us because we will not be doing anything to leverage the technology to make ourselves better. Much like if you were sitting down and you refused to use Excel because you felt like you were the math wizard and you can make, big spreadsheets by hand on a whiteboard or something like that. Like it's not going to replace you, but if you refuse to kind of use that as a tool, you won't be relevant anymore. So I think it's really this idea that we need to understand that computers by themselves will never win, humans by themselves will never win, but it's the human plus computer that's going to actually win the day. But I think it's important for us to develop the skills of understanding how to leverage this as a tool and not as a means of just replacing work that we don't want to do. Does that distinction make sense?
I think for sure, and I think you're absolutely right that if you're like an early adopter and like such a big fundamental change on like technology, you will like vastly outperform everybody around you just by that sheer fact. I think that's totally true.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Can you think of anything like a mindset shift or a skill or something that we really need to be focused on with this new disruptive technology in the workplace and our personal lives or in society too, right? So
Yeah.
if you think about if we want to make it social, deepfakes are aplenty nowadays. And so with relatively minimal experience in video editing or graphic design or anything, it's trivial for people to create a deep fake of a politician saying something that they didn't. And with the spread of these kinds of things on social media and whatever. So like, are there any other skill sets or mindsets we should be thinking about developing or growing alongside the emergence of AI in society, the workplace, or even in our personal lives?
We talked before the recording started, we talked briefly about like politics and like, I think there you need to be like super skeptical, especially now if the platform providers don't really, monitor that super well of what you see. I think there's going to be like big attacks like from both sides on like fake content and like made up stories, made up images. So that's pretty scary. And I also don't really know what the future of that looks like. Maybe we need to have some like way of like verifying that certain content is actually not AI generated. That's probably like a big thing that needs to happen somehow. But then how does that actually work technically? That's probably pretty hard. And then I think we need to get in the minds of being like both skeptic and and curious, because it also, if you just close your eyes and say like, hey, this is like terrible, then you also become curious about it. And I think being curious is super important, because a lot of people, they also see LLMs and they look at like, okay, this is like a big math statistic model I'm never going to understand. But actually it's not, it's not super hard to understand these things. Actually, like I'm also not at a point where I could train one, right? But like understanding the basics to the point where you can kind of like gauge some things off of it. I think that's really easy, and just like trying to stay informed with what's happening and getting like a deeper understanding, at least to some degree, is going to be super relevant.
Yeah. The example I like to use a lot with people who aren't in the tech industry and don't understand what a large language model is the fact that that is actually nothing more than a mathematical prediction engine, right?
Yeah.
So even though it comes across as something that's very confident that it can quote unquote think and whatever, actually it's just doing a lot of calculations behind the scenes to figure out the relevance of the next word in the sentence, essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if you don't understand that, then it does seem like a person that's talking to you, and it is more likely that you're going to take whatever response you get as something that's really credible, and whatever. It is fantastic at sounding very confident and also to a certain extent sycophantic, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes I'll ask questions and it's just deliberately ask something really crazy, and the response is, that's a great idea. Yes, you should put glue in your cookie recipe, or, whatever, because so I think people need to understand the limitations of this. I think this AI literacy topic, right? And it's why it's important for us to have a definition of it and also understand the limitations of it, so we can be critical about the information that we see, the responses we get, and how we use the tools and everything in our work life and our personal life and just society writ large.
Yeah, these things are funny. I mean, if you ask somebody like, why is it a good idea to go party today? Then it will just tell you why it's a great idea. And they won't say like, hey, are you working tomorrow? Question mark. Because that's like what a friend would say. A friend would say like, hey, cool question, but like, should you actually go out? It's like a good idea today. And the model will never do that, right? It will just give you like all the great arguments for why you should do exactly what you're already thinking of. And I think just having these things in mind kind of like are very helpful when you ask these things, like any question, essentially.
Yeah. Well, pro tip, because prompt engineering is so important. When I ask a question, especially if it's something important, I leverage large language models for brainstorming mostly. I always put a sentence that says, now tell me exactly why this is not a good idea, or now tell me the opposite argument to this, or whatever, just so I get that extra layer of it back. Because otherwise, you can get caught in this kind of rabbit hole of this self-fulfilling prophecy of whatever question you ask being a good idea, and all of the things to prove that that's a good idea, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. So, what are some questions that you, your customers, or colleagues have about AI at large? Like, are there any places that still give you some hesitancy? Are there things that you're waiting to be simplified or solved with AI in your work in the future?
So many. So essentially, we, of course, were super interested in the benchmark performances of the new models, right? And also like how real world applicable is this really? Because I don't know if you remember this, but like in November, December, January, back to back, we had like massive increases in like performance on the models, right? Like you had 3, 4 like releases in a row where every time you looked at it, you were like, wow, like this is just so much better than what we had, like last month. And I feel like, the releases that have come now were a bit more like GPT 4.1. We're like, okay, like it's now better at creative writing, like great release, but like, not super impressive. And then there have happened some great things, like VO3 is obviously like super stunning. And then, the reasoning models were good, but like I'm still waiting, what happens this year. And there's so much money being funneled into it. So everybody's working super hard on it. But the question is, how fast will these things then now really become better? Right. And I think we don't really have an internal view on it either. Like everybody has like their own expectation management. The overarching question is like, have we hit a wall? Are we going to hit a wall? Then that's what everybody's asking themselves. And I'm not smart enough to answer the question, but definitely we're not on the same pace anymore than we were like 6 months ago. I think that's for sure. We are definitely slowing down to some degree.
Yeah. Do you feel like we might start to approach the point of diminishing returns where
Yeah. I think the counter argument
maybe
would
things
be,
are getting good enough, right?
yeah. And the counter argument would be like, but like 5 more IQ points at the edge become increasingly more important. For example, like, if you are 100 IQ versus 105, the 5 don't matter as much. But if you like 130 versus 135, those 5 probably matter a lot more than the 5 before that. So I think that's kind of the counter argument to that. And then my question to that is like, but is that equatable? Like, is that actually how it works? Like, I don't know, and yeah.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious because I see definitely like the derivative of progress is decreasing, right? So we can see this like each new model that comes out. Okay, great, you solve some new problems, but is it really transformational? So on and so forth. But the amount of investment required to get these new models out versus the progress that we're making with them is really becoming concerning. Like this ratio is getting larger and larger. And I wonder if we're just more in a place where we should be thinking about how we can actually apply this technology in meaningful needle moving ways in the real world, rather than trying to continue to throw money at the same, basically larger and larger training projects that we have, which
Yeah.
require more and more infrastructure and more content for training data and more people to manually validate the training data. Like, are we really getting the marginal improvements that we were hoping for or expecting, or which might require the level of investment we have? Is good enough just good enough sometimes?
So I see it the same way you see it. I think the foundation model space is a race to the bottom. I think there's almost no shareholder value created there, in my opinion. I think the real value creation is still on the application layer. And there specifically, I think it's in like industry specific applications, like, building the next PwC AI first. How does that look like, right? So how does like a CFO advisory business unit work with AI first? How does it, work in SAP? Like, how does it, take invoices from like 15 different countries and like, consolidate them, and, how does it do that? I think those are like kind of where the value creation really is, but that's also much harder to build than some of the like more fun demo based applications that we're seeing today. You need to like collect real world data from like lots of different people, train very like use case oriented models on that thing. And that's kind of, I think Case Text was like a good example for this. I think that's what they were called,
Mm.
who, I think they sold for like 600, 700 million to Reuters or something, where they just did like AI in law, but like very early on. And they just like hired like actually really, really, really good lawyers to like train their models to like, label data, to look at cases, to then say, hey, this is kind of the verdict I would have come up with, feed that back into the model. So they built up like this massive proprietary data set with like top experts in the world. And I think that's kind of the playbook that, be up for grabs to replicate in lots of different industries. And I think the people that are doing that are probably being smart, and that's probably the right thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So let's wrap it up with any resources. So anyone who's curious about AI, resources you might recommend, like newsletters, podcasts, tools, thought leaders to follow, mindset shifts, books. What would you recommend?
I think books are too slow paced. Unfortunately, I like books, but I think it's just not. You
Me too.
can't like this is just not how it works at the moment. I think actually X is probably the best place. Unfortunately, like if you create really your own bubble, it does really work. Just like follow all the like good researchers at all the different labs and just look at what they like, and that already like gives a good indicator at what's credible. Follow the people they follow and build your own audience. If you want any specific advice, I think Kaparthi is doing a great job on YouTube. Of course. And then there's some like good podcasts. So I think I personally really like Training Data, which is the Sequoia podcast. Training Data is great. They have really interesting guests and like they break things down. I think the Cursor founders were on there recently. That was a super fun episode. So I think that's really, really meaningful. The YC podcast is actually pretty cool. So they have like cool episodes sometimes. And then, yeah, I think those are like the main ones.
Cool. Makes sense. And what about you? Where can the listeners find you?
Yeah, so it's Peek AI, so PEEC.ai. And again, what we do essentially, analytics for AI search. So we help companies understand how they show up in ChatGPT, Perplexity, if they want to optimize their organic visibility on those platforms.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in to Get Discovered, a podcast where AI, SEO, and the future of online visibility collide. For more about us, swing by Prerender.io. We make sure your site isn't hiding from Google, Bing, or the next-gen AI bots sniffing around for fresh content. I'm Joe Walsh. See you next time.